The day Joe Rogan had me on and I talked about PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers are making billions upon billions of dollars a year. Then
so
they
the
come
patient pays more than they actually are paying for the drug.
Correct. It set off a nuclear bomb to now where the president of the United States is, and that's how I met RFK. So you were asking me before we went on air, how optimistic am I? It all depends on how impassioned and focused the American people are. Because the biggest impact to all of this is honestly guys like you. It's podcasts. It's the day Joe Rogan had me on and I talked about PBMs, it set off a nuclear bomb to now where the president of the United States is, and that's how I met RFK. I met Bobby Kennedy because somebody from his staff had heard my Rogan podcast where I broke down PBMs and they said, RFK is going to be in Dallas. Do you want to meet him? Would you like to come sit down? I said, I would love to. And this is when he was the presidential candidate. And I drove from Austin, Texas to Dallas, and he rolled up his sleeves and sat down with me for 30 minutes, grilling me. What PBM, explain to me, how are they making the money? Well, wait a second. How do they make the money if they're the insurance company? And then I had to explain, because all of those bills get passed on to the employer. So we've talked a little bit, you alluded to that my company's between Ways to Well and my pharmacy Revive, I employ 500 plus people. Okay, every year I have to meet with the insurance companies where they break down the cost of care to insure my employees. And they're gonna say, Brigham, Joe Bob was on an antidepressant that cost us $500 a month. And Susie was on a weight loss drug, a GLP-1 that cost us $1,300 a month. That's $20,000 a year, basically, for these employees. We've got to make our money. We're going to mark your copay, your deductible, and your expenses on your employees up. So at the end of the year, that cost gets passed on to me, the employer.
Right.
I'm paying for that, and you, the employee, are paying for that. The insurance companies never pay the dollar amount they're showing us on the balance sheet. They pay a fraction of that because the rebate's held at the pharmacy benefit manager middleman companies that are them. And so I was breaking all that down for RFK, and that's how I met Bobby Kennedy, and then he invited me on his podcast, and that's how I kind of got pulled in a weird way into the Maha stuff.
I definitely think he's the best person for the job through the Secretary of Health and Human Services. This is his whole life's work has been this. So you spending time with him, kind of behind the scenes, is he the real deal?
He's the real deal. I was telling you right before we went on air. There was an issue going on with the FDA, and I had sent his team a message, and I thought, his chief of staff and Stephanie and RFK have been unbelievable. And I thought, well, how will it change once he's elected and he's in power? And I know he's really busy, and I reached out to them about an issue, and literally within a few hours, Bobby called me, RFK called me and said, what is the issue? And I explained it, and he said, lay it out in an email, send it to me. Within a day, he had forwarded it to the FDA and asked for them to sit down and talk to me about the challenges. And you and I talked before we came on air too, like I'm a proponent for psychedelics in utilization in a clinical setting, under the right supervision, with the right checks and balances, as a treatment modality for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. There's phenomenal data there. We're both huge proponents for stem cells, stem cell research, and biologics, and how much these biologics can change the trajectory of somebody's life physically and give them the ability to heal and recover in a way that their body just can't without it.
Yeah.
And then lastly, peptides and preventative care. And RFK is a supporter of all these things. Unfortunately, historically, the FDA has not been at all. In fact, they've done the opposite and almost declared war on this entire sector of preventative care, of psychedelic use, of stem cells, peptides, any of it.
So I was just in Washington, D.C., and I was Congressman Derek Van Orden, Eli Crane, and Morgan Luttrell invited me to testify on alternative treatments for mental health for veterans with PTSD. And it's mainly focused on the suicide epidemic. Mm-hmm. And as I was testifying, it came out that and this is from the VA reps that were testifying as well, any treatment for mental health for veterans through the Veterans Administration has to be approved by the FDA. So, I mean, to me, immediately, it's a very much a conflict of interest. Why would the FDA, one government organization, have to approve for another organization, and that only allows for clinical care? Am I wrong in that?
No, you're spot on. And that in my challenge with the FDA is if we historically look at the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they were asleep at the wheel on food. Okay, they let all these generally accepted as safe chemicals be put in our food. Well, who did the analytics on generally accepted as safe? Industry, self-regulated, and did their own studies. And so if we even go back to like a basic thing like a food dye, right? Like red dye, whatever, red dye 40. Okay, they're basing it off their analytics, off an adult human, off somebody eating the dosage that's put in the food. Who eats the amount of Cheetos that's on the bag? Nobody. And what about a child who's eating 20 of these things in a day? I'm no argument ultra processed foods are bad. Like that's bad alone, but all the chemicals aren't good either. They let all that come into the marketplace. Then you go to the opioid crisis. They created and perpetuated the opioid crisis. Most of FDA's funding comes from Big Pharma. That's one of the problems. I think it's 49% or something of their funding. It's staggering, whatever it is. I'm blanking out, but it's a huge chunk of the revenue that funds the machine comes from industry itself. And those relationships have a ton of cross-pollination. 12 out of the last 14 heads of the FDA have gone to work for industry. So if I'm going to take a job in Big Pharma 18 months down the road, the last thing I want to do is implement a program that allows accessibility to a treatment like Ibogaine that overnight eliminates the need for all antidepressants if it is half as efficacious as it appears to be in the preliminary studies.
So why would the VA forfeit that authority over to the FDA?
A lot of that, I don't even want to go insidious. I think a lot of it is just incompetence.
Okay.
Like there's a level of bureaucracy in the machine, and the VA probably says, we're not the ones that regulate and decide what treatments are safe. Why don't we let the FDA tell us? And then it's easy to say no. You never get in trouble saying no. Like attorneys will say no if they can get away with it 10 out of 10 times because they're never going to put you in harm's way.
Yeah.
But we also don't innovate, cure, or help anybody if the answer is an obstructionist mindset. And so on one side of the aisle with the FDA, they open the floodgates and allow industry to walk through the door with all these treatments that have never had a human safety. And this is where I call bullshit. Right. And again, let me be clear. This is prior to Secretary Kennedy and Marty Makary taking over the FDA. And I've gotten to meet Dr. Makary. He testified with me at the Senate level. I know for sure he's a good human and that RFK are good people and that they have the best of intentions. But they have inherited a ball of yarn that is going to be very difficult to unwind.
As things tangled up.
And it is very tangled and very messy. Like even my meeting with the FDA, when I flew in to meet with them, there were 6 people in there just taking notes. And I was asking questions about backlogs in the United States on GLP-1s, as for an example. And I'm covering a lot of ground here, but it's to try and explain it. One of the things I brought up was, how did you, the FDA, decide that GLP-1s are off the backlog? Their answer? Well, Eli Lilly told us that they can meet the needs of the American people.
A pharmaceutical company.
The company that has the most to gain by selling GLP-1s.
Right.
That's one of their blockbuster drugs. So Novo and Lilly are the 2 big players. And I said, okay, well, if we look at the data itself in the United States, we had a pharmacy advocacy group that called 30,000 pharmacies a month for 12 months. Less than 6% of patients could have filled their prescription. Wow. So again, I ask you, how can you trust industry to self-regulate? Because time and time again, what we've learned is you don't let the person who has the most to gain, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome.
Yes.
Like we cannot let industry self-regulate. And I go back to, if they're doing that with a simple product like a GLP-1 that is obviously still on a backlogs list, Why would Lilly and all these companies want to shut down compounders' ability to make it and meet the need of the American people? Because it shuts down competition.
Yeah.
So if they're doing that on that compound, and you look at the other parts of their bag that make billions, antidepressants, antipsychotics, diabetes medications, think of the catastrophic effect to the pharmaceutical industry if we really do practice the ways well approach to medicine, if we really do get proactive, predictive, and preventative. Because 80+% of chronic diseases are preventable through diet, lifestyle, and intervention, not a drug.